Aloha, namaskara, welcome. So today we unpack the third sutra on asana of 196 Yoga Sutras. 3 pertain to asana, but ultimately all of the Yoga Sutras pertain to the posture of our mind and where we get stuck or stagnant, or where there's collapse or sag or overreaching. And of course, all of the sutra reinforce one another. So they're meant to not only be woven together, but woven into our lives and those liminal moments when there's the pause between breaths, between thoughts, between, our daily agenda, that we can recenter with the sutras and find that reconciliation in a world of paradox. How do we find that? When we have linear thinking, we think, okay, I just got to get to the end. That creates the tenuousness. And Yoga Sutra, like a mala, they're circular. So they're meant to be revisited to turn the gem. So let us go to our share screen. And can you see it? Yes, excellent. So as you explore the poles of opposition, the North Pole and the South Pole, the negative and the positive polarities of your spine, you know that when we're centered, we come into a state of equilibrium, which ultimately presents as neutrality. You'll feel the soles of your feet on the floor, the circumference of your heels, the center of your arches, and find your line from the crown of your head through the front of your spine, all the way down to your perineum. When the coccygeal and the brainstem plexes are aligned, we find nirodha, expanded awareness. Exhale all the way down to the bottom of your heart, all the way down to the hammock of your perineum. Pause, and then take in the fresh impulse circumferentially. Feel it as light radiating through your being and your auric field. Sthira Sukhamasana. Posture or attitude is to be cultivated with the 2 qualities of steadiness and ease, which result in resilience and stability, our ability to recenter even when outside forces push against us. Prayatna Shaitilyananta Samapatibhyam. It's natural that when you make an effort, some tension arises. Loosen that tension without collapse and fuse yourself with the current of life force within. Expand yourself and reconcile yourself with the fact that this is an endless process. Trust, keep going, keep growing. You are guaranteed success. And today's sutra, 248, Tato, dvandvānabhighātaḥ, anabhighātaḥ. Tato dvandvā, Tato dvandvā, Tato dvandvānabhighātaḥ, Tato dvandvānabhighātaḥ, Tato dvandvānabhighātaḥ, Tato dvandvānabhighātaḥ, dvandvānabhighātaḥ. Tato dvandvānabhighātaḥ. Tato dvandvānabhighātaḥ. Tato dvandvānabhighātaḥ. And as you feel yourself lean into this wisdom, stay into your center and feel the absorptive and highly indelible quality of your chitta, the stuff of consciousness. From that removal of tension, the production of relaxation, from this identity of being the doer and letting that go, the dvandvāns, which come from dvi, to divide, or the poles of opposites, the dualities, unpacks, they no longer assault you. They no longer tear you apart. Then the yogi is no longer affected by the poles of opposites, nor troubled by dualities of sense experience. Wow, this is a big one. Okay, so obviously if we return to yoga, yoga means yuj, to yoke together. So it implies that unless there were tensions, we couldn't have yoga. All right, we need that sense of tension to keep us growing. But when there's a split, when there's a conflict, and this also relates to relationships, when both parties don't feel heard. And this could even be our inner manager. We have the parts of self that have an agenda. There's the child, there's the petulant teenager, there's the discursive mind, there's the soul, there's the heart, there's the stomach pit, there's the husband, the mother-in-law. When these parts, when we have even this inner manager, which says, oh, just stay calm. And, you know, it's certainly true, but sometimes we bypass the work. So it's like the wholeness is being able to wrap yourself. I think of it like a big hug, you know, and hold all the parts and listen to the parts without being patronizing or placating. And so even to manage the inner manager, whoa, there's a few more years of therapy right there. And it's natural that we're going to seek balance. And that seeking is what impels our growth. So many of you have heard the story of the Rig Veda. I sometimes share an excerpt of the birds, two birds in one tree. And I think it was either Rishi Vashishta or Rishi Vishvamitra who composed this poem. And it speaks about how one bird eats in the tree while the other one watches. And one is killing a fruit in which life feeds on life. So it's then that sense of tension of how are we in the world? How can we enjoy the world without getting hung up by our experiences and still maintain the witness perspective without becoming dissociative? Even the sense of hatha yoga is about merging polarities, ha, sun, and ta, moon. In the postures, how we utilize the front and back bodies to become less superficial in our awareness and move from our center. Mr. Iyengar would say the back body is like God. You can't see it, but you have to go with it to feel it. And then when you're in that place, all movements come from the core self. It's also what we spoke about in the last sutra, where rather, certainly there's training involved, but when you're really well trained, rather than it being a neocortical process, it's more about allowing the parasympathetic nervous system to make micro adjustments to hold your sense or to be held in your center in the gravitational field. This is Ida and Pingala, so sun and moon again. And even the yin and yang symbol, which we're all familiar of, there's that wavy line, which means that the dualities are always fluctuating. And then there's the points within. So in the white field, there's the shadow point. In the shadow point, there's the light point. And the opposites are always present. When we inhale, there's the exhale. When there's flexion, there's extension. So in this sutra, Patanjali says, if you're able to maintain this attitude of joyfulness, of discovery, in which you're always resting yourself on something bigger, okay, something more expanded, then the pulse of extremes are resolved. Asana resolves opposition. So I'm going to read a quote from my book, The Yogi's Roadmap. Life, like asana, becomes a practice between the poles of the opposites, one of slackening and forcefulness, effort and surrender, all directed with a fusion of intent and action and integrated with patience and sensitivity, Shaityananta. We not only live within the paradox, but also understand its nature. So in asana, we have this pulse of extremes. And where the dvandvāns reveal as dualism in practice is where we tend to only move from one or two places. And rather than practice creating more coherency and integration, the practitioner will become increasingly disintegrated and imbalanced, which equals pain. So this is where we push the front body into the back body or vice versa, or we wobble from side to side. And until we discover how to harness the polar field, and Albert Einstein said, we live in a magnetic field. So until we can learn to harness that energy and migrate in our deep center, we're going to be assaulted abhighātaḥ by the dvandvās, the dualities. So samadhi, integration, and it's synonymous with nirodha, expanded awareness, your ability to see multiple points of view simultaneously, invites us to change our approach to release, to engage the opposite side, to affect the alternate side, to find our center by engaging equal and opposing action. And then inspired by the sensitivity of our breath, we can make these really refined and nuanced adjustments, which then help us to penetrate from the more obvious or sthula layers to the more sukshma, the more subtle. And then that is the state of tanu that we hear in the postures. Purvottanasana, Uttanasana, Prasarita Padmottanasana, which is that tanu means thinning or to go beyond prior self-imposed limitations. And then we discover the midpoint of duality in which we work all actions in tandem from our center, become centripetal. Can't say that word. Centripetal. Now, in life, how can we be undivided by life's pulls and demands, as well as tending to our own soul's desire? We're invited to gravitate to the middle path and to appreciate that, yoga is a quantum physics practice. It's where we can make a huge leap in this fine, nuanced adjustment. And to understand that the law of physics relates to consciousness as well, that opposites are always changing into each other. And I spoke with a quantum physicist who I have the honor to train, and she said that the more things change, the more they transform into themselves. So the more we can surrender to yoga as an alchemical process of transformation, the more we relax into a state of balance and we realize that we are part of the divine creation and we continue to discover our most authentic and unique self. Neurologically speaking, when we practice asana, and it's a very subtle science, in an intelligent way, but then we get out of the intellect, non-dualism, and transcendental awareness, it commences with the redistribution of our consciousness from the frontal brain and cerebral cortex to the gray matter in the center of the brain. And I always think of the gray matter when, in this sutra, it's like dvandvās are black and white thinking. Okay, so it's like there's a whole world of possibilities in between. And this is where the master gland of the hypothalamus is seated, the cranial sacred fluid is generated and regulated, and it creates a harmonic, which, by the way, has fluidity in our entire body and into a place of resonance. Then the brain, rather than it just being one of the sense organs, is recalibrated to become an instrument of prajna, which is intuitive awareness. This is an activation of our pineal gland, which sits in the hypothalamus like a pearl, and it opens the gateway for superconsciousness and visionary states. In the outer world, we're always experiencing pairs of opposites. They're always in oscillation. And this, when it hooks into us, or we get hooked into it, creates vikshepa, distraction. So practices, if we could think about one thing that can give us steadiness in the world, it's our practice. That's a point of stability. And it helps us to find freedom from the disturbing reactions that can occur with world changes. We can feel where stress has enveloped us cellularly, where there's conflict, and resolve these tensions, and then harness that energy so that our life becomes more self-supporting and we can find effortlessness. So it's not just about our bones or our joint, but also our energy centers, our breath, our mind, our spirit, our heart, our wisdom. And then we fuse samapatibhyam, the force of creation, with our timeless spirit, and it creates a feeling of lightness. So our skill to navigate the terrain of Maya, which is the world that it's not illusory, but the fact that it's always changing and we want to hold a picture of it, that's the illusion. So if we can navigate that with skill, that's the mark of being a tantrika, one who is living in the state of Tanu and reconciled with the pull of opposites. So from the standpoint of the tantrika, nothing is rejected, and all of life experience is used for the evolution of the self. Meister Eckhart wrote, "Ultimate and highest leave-taking is leaving God for God, leaving your notion of God for an experience that transcends all notions," where yoga is moving beyond beliefs into direct experience. So we don't just do this through asana, but asana becomes the laboratory from which we can feel oneness and wholeness in ourselves and others and be in a state of true absorption. And the result of this is the perfect posture described as being free from polarities. Now, again, that's the black and white thinking, and even the tendency to catastrophize, right? If we follow the media or the news, everyone's either doing really great or they're doing terrible. No one's like, oh, ho hum, not much going on today, okay? Everything has to be like these extremes. So can we instead embrace those extremes, but also those gray moments, so that we're living in a natural state of meditation? Now, efforts and goal orientation. Now, certainly we're going to have an intention and a mission in our life, but when we're goal oriented, we have to be careful that the ego isn't driving it, because the ego expresses itself through the efforts. Asana is meant to make our ego more transparent. And where the ego tends to define itself by its limits, this is me, that's not me, I like this, I don't like this, we focus on the bigness, on the infinite, that's last sutra, in which we don't identify with poles of the opposites like life and the world, and realize that how we know things is by their opposites. Okay. So I want to circle back again because this sutra really changed my life. The purpose of life is to experience the world of opposites, and this is known as bhoga, and then to be free of them, apavarga. Bhoga is that active part of our mind that's always seeking pleasure. And this is the core obstacle of our own wholeness or yoga. It's like if we deny that shadow part of our being. So this isn't just mean removing ourselves from the pull of the world as far as like cold and heat and thirst and hunger, but even craving accolades, wealth, comfort, fame, external recognition, because yoga is self-recognition. Even in our friendships, as Venkatesh comments, when we want to keep a friend, when we're sitting there implying them or ego fluffing them, we're already turning them into an enemy. Rama speaks about equanimity in this sutra as the ability to be steady and firm in the face of all changing circumstances. And life is the greatest test of that. So it's about bringing our physical and mental into harmony and understand that our body is going to express what is in the mind. And we experience the world through the sensory channels. So asana is not just physical exercise, but to understand and integrate these strong psychic components within us. Then we're freed from the fluctuation of the gunas, the protons, neutrons, and electrons, and that everything's changing. And someone who's really masterful of this, there's many stories, the great masters, they don't even need anesthesia. They can apply the feeling of tranquility to the centers of sensation. On a more basic level, we're probably not going to go get a root canal without anesthesia. I don't recommend that you do. But we can still apply, because I know if I'm going in for something, I still get tense, even when I can't feel it. We can use what we've learned in asana to help us to relieve what we're going through. If we're in back pain, we know which asanas to do therapeutically. And then we can look to what is the source of that pain. What are the habitual patterns? And realize that pain is a form of restlessness. Might mean we need to rest less, might mean we need to walk more. And within the unexamined consciousness, we're always trying to get away from pain, but to realize that bliss is preceded by pain. And the state of beatitude or of being in a blessed place is preceded by a death of some sort. So needless to say, sequencing is an art in yoga. And changes in the way that we sequence postures radically changes the effects. Stay within the boundaries of comfort and always know where the threshold of discomfort is. And then we, through the application of effortless, we refine and expand our range of comfort. So we can become more fluid and move in and out more easily in the postures of life. And Patanjali goes on to say, this requires continual enhancement of the intensity of your practice. You must voluntarily apply resistance in order to find release and neutrality. Okay. So When you explore that sense of resistance, which creates, tensegrity or dynamic awareness, we combine it with pranayama, bandha, and mudra. And in a practice like Agni-saradauti, you utilize this high degree of resistance, but still adhere to this sense of effortlessness. And then that gives you an opportunity to be aware of where in your body you're most affected by contraction and expansion, and to engender these alternating forces of resistance and release. And this is what creates the pump of cranial sacred fluid up the spine. It tones the vagus nerve, which is kind of like our social nerve, so we can handle the extremes of others or of life, which then helps us to become more robust, increases our vitality, our strength and stamina, and it restores and deepens the link between our heart and our brain and even our enteric brain. And this awakens a cellular intelligence. And this sutra precedes the sutras on pranayama. So all of this is necessary for practices of pranayama. And those are fantastic sutras too. This is such a juicy set we've got here. When the posture is mastered, tension is removed. The result is natural relaxation, and we realize the omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent self. We realize the world is not one of dualism, but a trinity of mind, body, and spirit. Okay. So this harmony of opposing forces, rather than seeing them in tension, to see them in a harmonic resonance. Our sense of individuality depends on this contrary flow of cosmic forces. Happiness is harmony of ourself with the cosmos. When we become stronger in ourselves, and we're going to explore this in the weekend workshop, how much prana is in the body versus around us. When they're out of balance is when we feel sick and tired, okay? When we're in balance, we feel inspired. And, inspiration moved me lightly, if any of you know that song. So it elevates us and activates us to be more curious in our nature. And then we can work with these opposing cosmic forces and find more balance. So questions for ourselves is, this sutra speaks about how the mind loses its identity, the dualities no longer assaults us. So how does your own mind assault you? Whose voice is it? And can we go beyond that, beyond the polarities of joy and sorrow, of approval, disapproval, honor, dishonor, success and failure? When we can go beyond those dualities, it results in true freedom, and we find the true seat or āsana of steadiness. Then we're in flow. We gain momentum and our energy is increased, and we're not easily distracted or diverted. We can still be aware of our body's changing needs, but we adapt to our environment. And there's a state of calmness that ensues without being distracted by our body. Okay, now, of course, what preceded this were the yama and the niyama. So with this sense of cultivating right attitude and cultivating our own character, we can maintain equilibrium even with our changing moods. And, many of the yogis speak about this. This is our greatest challenge, is reconciling the moody nature that is part of our psyche, and how we can transform those raw emotions into our drive to get free and experience our fullness. So really, we have to see where our personality weaknesses are. and address them. So maybe we make a decision. I'm going to sit for 20 minutes or 3 hours. And then when pain arises, because pain will arise, it's not about enduring the pain. It's not about sitting on the pain, but sitting with it and utilizing it. You might ask, well, what is this sensation? Is this a neurological phenomenon? Is it my avoidance? Is it my fear or resistance? And if you feel a nerve twitch, you just let it do so. And you begin to ask why your mind interprets this neurological impulse as pain. Why not pleasure? That state of observation is what we called yoga. We observe the oscillating nature of the body, the mind, and the emotions. And then we begin to discern what's the difference between an emotional affectation, a feeling, an attitude, or even a physical sensation. That process of inquiry reveals intelligence, which is then what remains. And that intelligence is held by duality, but transcends it. We realize that without dualities, day and night, me and the other, shadow, light, consciousness and unconsciousness, they can't exist without one another. Even our body works with dualism. When we're hot, we start to perspire, and this is a natural cooling action. So everything is going to be accompanied by its opposites. Joseph Campbell wrote, "Everything we know is within the terminology of the concepts of being and not being, many and single, true and untrue. We always think in terms of opposites, but the ultimate is beyond pairs of opposites." All right. So can we find a posture in life that is steady and comfortable, in which there is the least amount of effort in it, and where it's more a seat of contemplation of the infinite and of grace, where we're not bogged down by life? So this sutra is inviting us to be an optimist and to know that, often unhappiness will bring us happiness, and that even under sorrow and pain is healing and ultimately freedom and joy. Can we be content with the small happinesses, enjoy them, suck the nectar out of them, and then let it go without anticipating more? Yoga is to merge out of competitive and hierarchical thinking. Better than, worse than, man, woman, evil, good, sacred, profane. When we can see the whole picture, there's no more competition. And the wisdom or the prajna that awakens helps us to counteract with all these kind of bits and pieces, all these moving parts of our life and our psyche, all the counterparts, so that everything, we can feel how there's a flow, there's a give and a take. It's kind of like contact dance, right? And that we can evolve in how we're pushing and colliding and merging and separating without hindrance. It takes more energy to maintain maladaptive patterns and even fixed ideas. And Patanjali in the first sutra says, it's going against your own grain. I want to return back to Joseph Campbell. And I've been looking at his book, The Power of Myth. It's so great. I'm like, oh, there's a sutra. And he speaks about how in different cultures, there's common themes, okay? So in the Judeo-Christian culture, we have the Garden of Eden, which he says is a metaphor for the antecedent of opposites. It was this place of innocence. It was innocent of time and opposites of male and female. And that this place of innocence is that prime center from which consciousness then becomes aware of change. And then it becomes dominated by fear. As soon as he said, I am, there was loneliness, there was a feeling of desire, and there was the split into two. So if we look all the way back to our origin of the amoeba, this earliest life form, it reproduced without sex. Sex and that sense of division or merging polarities. I mean, there's sex magic and using in the yin and yang, and yoga as a form of magic where we use natural forces with intention. These initiations take us deeper into ourself, and we realize that we are also part and parcel of the yin and the yang, the masculine and the feminine, and we can feel our own androgyny, which is exemplified in the art of Shiva. So Shiva, who's half male and half female, in which one breast is convex and the other one is concave. Then we're no longer limited by sexuality, and we make peace with the shadows of ourself, and this is known as the process of enlightenment. Stanislav Grof, who was a West Coast psychologist, when LSD was legal, he did a lot of experimentations with it in consciousness, and into kind of like rebirthing, going back to this sense of origin. And then when LSD was illegalized, he said, it's no problem. We can use breath work. And so through the process of holotropic breath work, we go into the deep memory, our deepest memory in utero, in which there was a state of oneness. And then what happened were the contractions, the dvandvās. There was a feeling of fear in utero, and then the intense journey through the birth canal. And so the intensity of our life is just like Genesis. When we feel the opposite, the ego clings in fear and wants to hold on to what appears to be itself and what is not. Now, if we go further into these stories, because they're not meant to be taken literally, and the indigenous people know this, the creation, all stories of creation require some type of disobedience and controversy, okay? And this is one of the things that attracted me to Patanjali Sutra, was being a free thinker and a nonconformist, being willing to think outside of the box and understand that, this is like the drama of life. This is the story of our own creation, in which there's protagonist and antagonistic forces. And someone always breaks the covenant. And we'll see that as a standard folk motif. This is the one forbidden thing. And we're like, hunk. Give me a bite of that juicy apple. I want the juice, all right? So when we understand that life begins with an act of disobedience, all right? Clearly, the creator knew that man would eat the fruit. Don't eat that fruit. I mean, we all know that. If you say don't, kids don't hear don't. They just go for, you want to reinforce what you want to have happen. So this basic motif in myths that all was one, and then there was the separation, this fall from grace. Humans did something or said something that removed them from this divine origin, and then life is this soul journey of looking for our way home to our authentic selves. So we want to look at these dualities, where we get hung up. Can we hold them in balance? right and wrong, true and false, sin, atonement or at-one-ment, love, hate, life, death, heaven, hell, God, man or woman, positive, negative, laughter, tears. And I don't know about you, have you ever laughed so hard that you cried? Love and anger, joy and disappointments, outward, inward, inhale, exhale, time, space, future, past. So how does our thinking tend to get linear? And even in its linearity, it's often discursive. We can turn to the cosmos to understand ourselves. The cosmos aren't linear, okay? As we discussed before, even the moon, which is held on its axis, isn't completely spherical, but somehow it finds itself in the gravitational field. Our world is constantly encircled by the sun and the moon. And in India, when you draw a red ring around a stone, this is an act of consecrating what is holy. The sense of the circular or the spiral is where we go inward, and we recognize that now that stone is the center of the universe. It offers a still point in the turning of the world. And we understand that time and space are what inform our sensibilities, that when we are bound in the world would throw us off. And what lies outside of that ring is transcendent and cannot be known with our thought and the senses. The Buddha said, it both is and is not. And I did recently find a citing for this quote, which we've all heard. It's on t-shirts in Thailand and whatnot, but it actually has Vedic roots. Same, but different. Okay. But we also need to appreciate that, as we make choices in our life, there's the push of what we've been told to do, what we think we should do, what would be the right thing to do, what feels right. Whatever we do will always seem bad for someone else. So when we check the downward pull, or we go into this sense of center, when we drop in or ascend, you may have your own feeling, but it's essentially, metaphors. It means to go inward into the world of your energies, to understand your needs, your duties, the structures and their possibilities and how they meet the outer world. Because the outer world is our field of incarnation. And I learned a new word, novalis, Novalis, which is the seat of the soul where the inner and outer worlds meet. What we live is only a fractional inkling of what is really inside of you. So Joseph Campbell goes on to share that when he went to India to find a guru, he understood that the protocol is that you're never given the teachings without being asked. So the student has to ask for those teachings. And so the teacher said, do you have a question? And he said, yes, I have a question. And the teacher said, the answer for me and for you is yes. That's the affirmation for all things, that eternity is that sense of center with all of what is beyond our senses, which pull us into duality. So beyond the duality of the senses, in the here and the now, it's not just the future and the past. Tat tvam asi. This is it. And that awakening is what crosses us from the threshold of duality into true presence. Okay. So this still point, this place of neutrality, where our mind, its nature is to always be in gear, but we don't always have to engage with that motor. Sometimes we're going to cry. We have to cry. I mean, there's physiological reasons for it. But even when we're crying, to let it be an expression of feeling our own wholeness, to hold ourselves in the deep knowing of our own fullness. And sometimes it's required that we get angry, but to let it be useful, not blind rage or hostility. And in the story of the churning of the ocean of milk, it's like we use the asana to churn up, to bring up, to bubble up what's hidden in our depths, and then to transform poison into nectar. And as the ocean of milk is churned and the sun and the moon come out and Kaustubh and the wish-fulfilling tree and all of these jewels and cities and gods and goddesses, the final divine being that arises is Dvandvānabhighātaḥ, the god of Ayurveda, who holds a kumbha or a jar of nectar, and the full moon, which is the symbol of integrated psyche, a psyche that is reflective and transcendent in its own wholeness. Now that all sounds really good. But this sutra really invites us to appreciate complexity, to think, see, and feel in many layers. And I've been exploring structural integration. And one of the things we do is when we're working, and there's all these layers of fascia and bone, is to put one hand on top and one on the other and feel transference, to feel what's happening in between where you can't see. So this sense of receptivity is what moves us into a spontaneous adaptation where we're going to apply force and where we're going to withdraw force. And even balances the energies in both our nostrils so that when they're both balanced, the blockages of the past, present, and future are cleared. This sutra clearly refers to Advaita Vedanta. So Advaita means not to, and Vedanta means the end of knowledge. Where duality is polaric, interrelated, it's really not separate. Dualism is opposition, separation, and therefore a state of conflict. Duality makes it evidently clear that without such a process, there cannot exist any phenomenon. Neither of the two phenomenal objects, meaning like cognizer subject or cognized object, has any independent existence of its own. In fact, earlier in the sutras, we learned the whole world has been created for us to experience our own freedom. So that's the purpose of it. And the existence of one depends on the existence of the other. Dualism is identification or entification as a separate independent entity. And then this results as Maya, or what Patanjali terms as avidya, really not seeing the whole picture. So how can we use the understanding of duality rather than dualism in practical application in our day-to-day living by still having this sense of the original principle of oneness and duality which results? Okay. So non-duality in the Upanishads is described as to be freed of the pairs. This is the great liberation. And that it's the one taste that gives rise to both. So we have to discern so we can be freed of duality finding and find how we're held in this field of polarities. Otherwise, our life is just never going to be more than a continuous choosing, comparing, judging, blaming, and praising, rather than being and accepting and creating and resonating. Okay. So this is liberation, because we're finally relieved of trying to arrest the possible painful dream of spending our entire lives trying to find an up without a down, an inside without an outside, a good without an evil, and a pleasure without its inevitable plane. Non-dual experience at the end of knowledge is beyond knowledge. It takes us into the mystery beyond our own mind. And it's beyond our mind's capacity to conceptualize. And it can't even be described by the mind. But it's this lifting of the veil of avidya, in which it is described as drowning our individuality in an eternal ocean of love. What is truth? All objects are expressions of unqualified consciousness. And this always points us back to awareness. When we feel the purity of ourself, we are free of being problem addicted. So I've shared with you before, and it definitely comes up with this sutra, the Tibetan term of Shenpa, and Pema Chodron speaks very, very eloquently on this. Shenpa is the urge or the hook. It's the vritti. And it's when we get hooked in that moment of tightening when we're reaching for relief. So to get unhooked, you have to recognize the moment of unease and learn to relax in that moment. This is the āsana. Can you find inner ease even with the difficult? If we get hooked by the vritti, then it creates this cascade of our habitual tendencies to close down and withdraw. And this Shenpa, it thrives on the insecurity of change, which then triggers our old traumas. We experience this insecurity as a background of slight unease or restlessness. And this is where practice is meant to help us steady ourselves. And that ultimately, without a practice, we're lost. We're in a place of entropy. We don't have a center, and there's no sense of order in our lives. So Shenpa is usually involuntary, like the vritti, and it helps us to get to the root of why we suffer. Now, the practice, the Tibetan term is known as Shen-lak, which is renunciation. It literally means to shake things up or turn them upside down. And the term that Patanjali uses is vairagya, to see beyond the colorings of our own mind. First is awareness again. Sit with it. Stop the chain reaction of samskara and karma. Let it be, and just see things and see yourself as you truly are. The trick is to keep seeing. Don't let the softening and humility then turn into self-denigration. Then prajna awakens, clear seeing, innate intelligence. And when we're no longer ego-bound or involved, it stops this chain reaction. And we recognize our basic wholeness, our goodness. We're in a state of equanimity and we're open. And then that space within us helps us to see what opens space up in our lives. If we let our habits fill up that space, then it gets filled with the ego's need to assert itself through creating more separation. So this basic intelligence comes when we're not caught up in escaping our own unease, but the essence of realization of what is fresh in the moment. Like what is, instead of what's wrong, what's right about this situation. And we realize that we're on the path. Wherever we are, the path is right in front of us. To stay open with curiosity. And a practice that Pema Chodron invites us to do with ourselves or with others is that when someone's getting triggered, that maybe being ourselves, just pull on your earlobe. And then that gives yourself some sign that this isn't the time to start to get spun out, okay? It's better to revisit those issues when you're in a place of center. Okay. So then we can look into our shadow side of the Ittaratra. Now, this is from my book. Yoga will not necessarily provide you with a cure. Yoga acts as a lamp that sheds light on your distortions. And then it provides you with a map out of the woods by the means of viveka, your ability to make intelligent choices according to what is, so that you can navigate the spiritual path to your own essential self and creativity. Non-duality is about evolving ourselves and thinking without boundaries, that we can see the universe in a speck of sand. We can understand the totality and interrelatedness of everything. This final experience is the most sacred and secret moment. And it is too vast and too sweet for words. It is too precious to ever be completely communicated. It's just knowing that there is bad and good and light and darkness. So yoga gives us a pragmatic way in which we can realize our non-separateness, everything we take ourselves to be, and then to understand our unqualified presence of beingness. How we can dismantle fantasy, how we can become more selective and discerning and refine our attitudes and responses to life. How we transform poison into nectar, struggle into reconciliation, and ultimately how we can find balance and equipoise in a world full of contradiction and paradox. To be a connoisseur of your human experience. This absolute totalistic view is a profound and transformative experience. And Patanjali says you can only realize it intuitively. Consciousness knows the truth, and the truth sets itself free. I'd like to share a quote. The day you are born and the day you realize why are the most two important days of your life. Mark Twain. I had so much fun with this sutra. It's a great one. So for our breakout rooms, here is the inquiry. If creation requires disobedience and controversy, someone always must break the covenant. Whatever we do seems bad for someone else. Have you ever stepped out of the tribe, broken, spoken, or unspoken covenants? Did you question yourself, or were you one-pointed? How has controversy been instrumental for you to recenter into your personal equanimity and authenticity? Okay, so let's go to our breakout rooms. And here we go, about 2 to 3 minutes. wait for the others to come in. I'm watching you sway over there, Shanae, and I do that too. I think this is like the dvandvānabhighātaḥ, right? The inner pulse. All right, I get to see your shining faces again. Well, as always, I learned so much in the breakout rooms. Such an honor to be with so much wisdom. And something that Danielle said was that by stepping out of the tribe, even though she was disappointing people, even though it was difficult, realizing it was a real place of power, that's where we stand in the energetic field. And can we hold our own axis without even holding it, honestly? And for me, and I would imagine for many of you, those moments are the defining moments in our lives, aren't they? Where it's like, maybe we were set on a path of academia and then we did something radical, like became a yoga teacher, right? Or a yoga practitioner, did something that was completely, not even really a field necessarily, or a thing in this country, or step out of a particular lineage or tradition and lose that whole support and that community and the accolades and the recognitions that come with it. But somehow, as we do that, and again, I just want to reiterate that this path, this tradition of Patanjali is based on nonconformity, of being a trailblazer and being a free thinker. And that in doing that, in our own authenticity, we actually create a more eclectic community in which we appreciate the differences of one another. And by doing that, Patanjali says, when we gather, it's immediate samadhi, because we're integrating all of these multiple perspectives in a different way. I get to see through your eyes. I get to feel through your life. And then that expands my sense of self. Such a pleasure sharing these sutras with you.